Welcome to the 2021 Conference on Civil-Military Relations, Protests, Politics, and the Post-Pandemic World, Civil-Military Relations Moving Forward. Thank you for joining us. Thanks as well to the America in the World Consortium for sponsoring the conference, and to the Johns Hopkins SAIS Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies and the Duke Program in American Grand Strategy for organizing this event. I would like to introduce Dr. Paula Thornhill, the faculty advisor for this conference, for her opening remarks. Dr. Thornhill is currently acting director of the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies. She retired from the U.S. Air Force as a brigadier general in 2009. She's the author of Demystifying the American Military. Dr. Thornhill, over to you.
Mackenzie, thank you so much. And a huge thanks to the America in the World Consortium. I'd just like to echo your remark there. And I would also like to begin with, and you will hear me end on the same note tomorrow, with a huge thank to you and to all of the student leaders from both Hopkins and from Duke. What you all have done is remarkable, and I think that the attendees will see this and appreciate this over the next couple of days. What I want the attendees to know is we spent a lot of time, the student leaders and I, talking early on about what kind of theme we should have for the CivMil conference this year. As you know, this has been a running conference now for quite a few years. And we decided that what we really needed to do is to take head on the legacy of the Trump administration and to understand better how it shaped CivMil relations and look for points of both continuity and change as we look backward towards the Obama administration and we look forward to the Biden administration. We also concluded in our conversations that amongst the graduate student and fellow populations, both at Duke and at Hopkins, that there is just rich experience and expertise and intellectual research that we thought we should share. And so we really wanted to make sure that this was a student-focused conference, and we wanted to structure it in such a way that we help the next generation really give voice to its issues, to its concerns, and to its research. So you will notice, to all the participants, you will notice that all the panels are moderated by graduate students or fellows from both Duke and from Hopkins. And that we've also intentionally placed students or fellows on every panel. And we think that this will just add to the richness of the conversation and the diversity of perspectives and make it truly a more inclusive experience for all of us. We are absolutely excited about the topic, the way we've organized it, and all of the panelists and moderators. We just go from strength to strengths on this. And we hope that all of you attending not only sharing that excitement, but you will stay with us as we go through the four panels today and tomorrow. We tried to structure this in such a way that we minimize Zoom fatigue on the one hand, but on the other hand, had enough exciting things in both days that hopefully you will come back for more. So with that by way of background, let me get on to what is my primary task here, which is to introduce the Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, Dr. Elliott Cohen. Not only has he led SAIS through a very transformative period over the past few years, but through this all, he has managed to remain one of the world's leading experts and voices on CivMil relations. And we're thrilled and delighted that he agreed to help kick off this event with a few thoughts that he will share with all of us on what he sees as the current state of CivMil relations. Dean Cohen, over to you, sir.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Thornhill. I want to really begin by thanking the America and the World Consortium. You know, there are many awful things, obviously, that have emerged out of the world of COVID. But one of the good things is we're all a lot more comfortable with this technology. And one of the things it empowers is collaboration between great universities. And that's exactly what we have here, a joint enterprise between Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and Duke University. And so I'm particularly grateful actually to our IT staff who made all that possible. But I'm so glad that both schools, both groups of students are taking full advantage of it. And I think I hope this is one of the things that will continue. I do want to express gratitude to the students who put such a great deal of work into this. They've put together a wonderful and fascinating program. It is so right that students not only organize this, but they will be chairing the panels and indeed participating on them. And it is a great conference. We have officials from the Trump, Obama, and Bush administration. We have great scholars, and of course, the students themselves. You know, civil military relations is the perennial issue. Early on in my career, I taught in the strategy department at the Naval War College. We had a core course called Strategy and Policy, very historically driven. And I will never forget one day a somewhat disgruntled Navy captain came up to me after a particularly contentious class. He said, you know, this isn't really a course on strategy at all. This is a course on civil military relations. And I didn't quite put it to him this way, but he had really cracked the code. Civil military relations is in so many ways at the heart of the study of strategic issues, national security issues, and it's very much at the center of where we are today. You know, whether it's the role of the military in rolling out and delivering vaccines, whether it's the role of the military in handling violent protest, these issues never go away. And what is so striking to me is that the kinds of issues that we debate and discuss in the classroom and the ideas that we debate and discuss all of a sudden begin to have practical relevance. You know, when President Biden nominated retired General Lloyd Austin, as when President Trump had nominated retired General Jim Mattis to serve as Secretary of Defense, all of a sudden there's some first order civil military relations issues on the table. The answers aren't clear. You know, I know I disagree with my friend Dr. Thornhill on the last one in particular, but the point is these issues are alive, and it's really one of those fields where the theoretical questions really do have practical relevance, and that makes it so appropriate for a school like ours, or for the program that my other dear friend Professor Fever run. So I'm not going to keep you from the conference. It'll be terrific. I look forward to listening to it. And I think with that, I'm going to pass the floor back to you, Mackenzie.
Thanks, Dean Cohen.
All right, I'll get started in introducing our next speaker, Dr. Peter Fever. He is a professor of political science and public policy at Duke University and is also the director of Duke program in American Grand Strategy. Dr. Fever has written numerous publications on the subject of civil military relations and is most recently working with co-author Dr. Jim Golby on the book, Thank You for Your Service, The Causes and Consequences of Public Confidence in the U.S. Military. He's also an experienced practitioner in national security policy, as he has served on the National Security Council for the Bush and Clinton administrations. Dr. Fever is currently on sabbatical at Oxford. Still, he finds this topic important enough that he is joining us despite the late hour in England. Dr. Fever, welcome to the conference.
Well, it is very good to be here virtually, if not in person. I believe that the last year's conference on civil military relations might have been the last conference I attended pre-pandemic shutdown. And so it's particularly poignant to be back with everyone in this format. Of course, I want to thank you all for coming to this session. And I want to thank the team that has put this together, and Dean Cohen and Dr. Thornhill for their mentorship of this effort over the past several months. This is precisely the kind of thing that the American and the World Consortium was created to foster. It's it's at the heart of our mission, which is an engagement at the intersection of policy and scholarship, where a diverse and healthy debate is essential for good policy, where you have to hear from across the spectrum of perspectives and not just one. And so that's what the America and the World Consortium is about. And we're just so pleased to sponsor events that bring that to the fore. Now, the topic of this workshop, civil-military relations, could hardly be more timely. This past year has been as interesting and a tough a year for American civil-military relations as any in my professional life, or I suspect the professional life of anyone listening to this conference. If you talk to the senior military leaders, they will talk about the challenges that they have had to face, some of which they took them by surprise over the last 6, 8 to 10 months. And so they've been wrestling with it, and they need the benefit of folks like the students here who have a little bit more time on their hands to reflect on the challenges and the ways of adjusting best practices to the new era. And so, as I said, this is a timely workshop. We've got the right people to work on it, and I don't want to stand in the way of us going forward. Let's get to it. Mackenzie and Eric, back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Fever. On behalf of the Planning Committee, thank you all for joining us tonight. The overwhelming number of participants in this conference, 268, actually 285 now, is alone a good news story for civil-military relations, and that civilian leaders, military service members, national security practitioners, scholars, and the general public are taking interest in the subject of civil-military relations. Over 2 nights and 4 panels, this conference will examine the civil-military relations legacy of the Trump administration. Tonight's speakers will discuss relations between the American public and its military and current issues in the politicization of the military. Tomorrow night's speakers will discuss civil-military relations at the senior levels of government and how civil-military relations are playing out in the cyber domain. Each session will include a panel discussion with ample time for questions from virtual attendees. We want to encourage students in particular to ask questions. Now, please welcome our first panelist. Travis, over to you.
Hello, and welcome to the first panel of the conference, The American Public and Its Military, part of the Sykes Merrill Center and Duke Program in American Grand Strategies Conference on Civil Military Relations, supported by the America and the World Consortium. My name is Travis Ano, and I'm an MA candidate at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where I concentrate in strategic studies and European and Eurasian affairs. Tonight, I'm joined by 3 distinguished guests. Matt Donovan, former Undersecretary of Defense, Undersecretary of the Air Force, and Majority Policy Director for the Senate Armed Services Committee. Randee Farrell, Public Affairs Officer in the U.S. Army and a Fellow at the Counterterrorism and Public Policy Fellowship Program, Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. And Debra Wada, CEO, Sensei Ame Advisors, Vice Chair, National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service, and a former Assistant Secretary of Manpower and Reserve Affairs, Department of the Army. I will moderate a conversation with our speakers for about 30 minutes, and then we'll turn over to our virtual attendees for their questions. You may submit questions throughout this conversation using the Zoom Q&A chat function. Please be sure to submit your name, title, and affiliation with your question, and please indicate if you're a student, as I'm going to be prioritizing student questions. Please keep in mind that all conference sessions, including their Q&A portions, are on the record and recorded. As for all panels, the opinions of the moderators and the panelists are their own and do not represent their institutions or organizations. To start, I'd like to give a couple minutes to each panelist or each participant for some short opening remarks, starting with Matt and then followed by Randee and Debra.
Well, thanks, Travis, and thanks to Paula Thornhill for inviting me to participate today. I look forward to the discussion on civil-military relations. You know, we're approaching the 50th anniversary of the law in 1973 that eliminated the draft and established the all-volunteer force which began operating in 1974. Prior to 1973, draftees into the armed services represented a crosscut of the nation's citizenry and made up the bulk of our military during periods of conflict, namely the 2 world wars, Korea and Vietnam. This meant the military services had a balanced representation from all American walks of life, from all different regions of the country, and across a wide spectrum of economic backgrounds. Prior to the 1950s, America would only raise a large military for fighting in a particular conflict. Following the conflict, America would then disarm and reduce the size of her standing military force. This was not unintentional, as our founding fathers believed large standing militaries were not generally conducive to the longevity of free republics. When the Cold War with the Soviet Union emerged following World War II, we began an anomalous period in American history where we maintained a large military for almost 40 years. At the end of that period, we experienced the so-called peace dividend and again disarmed and reduced the size of the military and the DoD budget. Of course, throughout the 1990s, there were many small conflicts around the globe, culminating in the terrorist attacks of 9/11. That event still largely defines where we are today, with commitments centered around the Middle East, but with a military force roughly half the size it was during the Cold War. So what does all this mean for the relationship between America and our military? To sustain the all-volunteer force, the DoD has had to provide increasingly more pay and benefits to recruit and retain people for the armed forces. In some cases, for example, pilots in the Air Force's bonuses of nearly $500,000 each are given to entice them to stay on. Also, Congress finds it attractive to support our troops by providing generous pay raises and increased benefits each year. When you multiply a 3% pay raise by a couple million service members, you can see how we've reached the point where personnel costs now approach half of the annual defense budget. The military services today tend to get larger numbers of recruits from the South and the Heartland, and less from the West Coast and the Northeast regions. Recruits also tend to come from families already affiliated with military service. The military is certainly attractive to those seeking opportunities they may not get elsewhere. Excellent pay, advanced education, job security, lifelong health benefits, and an early retirement if they stay on for 20 years. But in my opinion, all these factors may make it increasingly difficult to differentiate serving in the military as a patriotic and professional calling versus just another vocation. With less than 0.5% of all Americans serving on active duty and about 7% who have ever served, it's understandable that gaps in perspectives appear between those who have served in the military and those who have not. This is not to disparage either career path, but the numbers and practicality tend to bear this out. These factors could be segmenting our society into a military class, if you will, and separate from the rest. But I'll leave it there. Thanks for the opportunity.
Travis, I appreciate the opportunity to be on this panel with Matt and Debra. I've been in the Army about 19 years. What I've seen is it become more representative of our society in those 20 years, but as Matt referenced, taking more effort to recruit and retain these individuals. What we need to look at is how we can articulate it in a way that these are opportunities that will not only serve them well in the military, but how the military will provide them opportunities to reintegrate with society to push our country forward. And I'll turn it over to Ms. Wada.
Thanks, Travis and the team, and Matt and Randee for your comments. I guess I would take it start by taking it from a little different perspective and sort of walk ourselves back, because being a part of the National Commission on Military National and Public Service, what was surprising to us and was brought to our attention was the lack of civics education across this country. And I know, Travis, that we had talked about this prior to our engagement, but what we found was the lack of civics education has, if we can't even have a conversation about government, right? 22% of Americans cannot name 3 branches of government. If you can't have basic conversations like that, then how do you get to the next step where you're talking about sort of military civil divide, and can you actually articulate in an informative way of sort of what your expectations is for the use of military force, or even why we have a standing army and why we have different branches of services and what they do? Because if you can't even articulate why are the way our government is structured, then how can you get to that next conversation? And I think that bringing in that perspective into this conversation would also be helpful. And on that note, I will turn it back over to you, Travis.
Thanks, Debra and Randee and Matt. To start out, and then I definitely want to loop back on this education piece. But with Matt, having worked in previous administrations, how do you think events under, not necessarily just the last administration, but administrations after that one, have shaped the public perception of the military? So you sort of talked about how recruitment comes from certain areas and perceptions are dependent on where you live. I was wondering if I could get your take on how you think administrations have played a role in that.
Well, I think, the military has enjoyed very high ranking in surveys on trust and confidence from the American people. And it has for a long, long time, in some surveys up to 70 or 80% confidence level, or very high confidence levels as compared to, say, other branches of the government or other institutions. So I think one of the foundational reasons why that is because of their stringent adherence to being apolitical. In other words, people in the military, are sworn to defend an ideal, right? The Constitution. And that's true no matter which party's administration is in power. And I think if that starts breaking down, and it has on occasion, I mean, we could go back to when Harry Truman fired Douglas MacArthur when he was in Japan. Right, because he publicly disagreed with some of the president's policies. You can snap forward to 1977 when Army Major General John Singlaub was fired by Carter when he was the chief of staff at U.S. Forces Korea because he disagreed with some of the policies that President Carter was trying to pursue. And then you have some, which is actually against the law for an American military officer to disparage the president in any way. So it was an Air Force Major General Harold Campbell in 1993 who was fired by President Clinton, not directly, but he was relieved through the chain of command for making disparaging remarks of the president. And then most recently we had General Stan McChrystal, who made disparaging remarks in Rolling Stone magazine about President Obama and other members of his administration, and he was relieved for that. So I think if the military adheres very stringently to remaining apolitical, and we've seen some struggles with that over the last year or so, then I think the confidence that the American public will hold in the military will remain high.
Thanks, Matt. Debra, from your experience in the Obama administration, is that what you saw? How do you feel the norms have changed in administrations?
I think that Matt's right. I mean, the apoliticalness of the military goes back for generations, but as we've seen in the recent decades, that has changed over time. And it'll be interesting to see whether, in fact, the sort of that approval rating and trust and confidence in our military maintains its level that it has been over the last decades. The concern is, I think, that we saw was that it's hard to have a conversation of mil-civ relations but in a way that does not devolve into sort of if the importance of service in this country becomes sort of a more political, like the best way to address it is if we talk about sort of the parts of service where it might not be as seen as beneficial or positive, then sometimes those debates devolve into you're not being supportive of the military in a way that is constructive, right? And so it's harder to have, I think, these sort of open and honest debates about the mil-civ relationship in this country, because it can get political in some ways. And so we need to figure out a way that we can have a conversation where we're not devolving to the politics of it, as opposed to trying to fix the actual issues that are going on.
So talking about these numbers of support for the military, so a lot of recent polling, especially coming post January 6th, shows this wanting support, because there's some evidence that there's a lot of veteran involvement in that. And I was wondering, Debra, how you thought that might play a role.
So I go back to my original point where, when we have an American public who is not as informed of their military or even their government, it's hard to have a conversation about sort of that mil-civ divide, right? What we see on TV is a small population of the military, but yet its ramifications goes far and wide, and that is what the average American sees. And so when you lay on that sort of social media, public news coverage, and you have a lack of understanding underneath it, you assume that that is the norm, and sometimes, and not necessarily just a small percentage of the population. And so the education piece, I think, is important for us as a country to make sure that we are educating the average American about what our military does, why we have it, what they actually do. I mean, going out in the last 3 years with the commission and engaging with the public outside of Washington, D.C. was eye-opening in the facts of what the perception of the military is. In some communities in this nation, terms like you are, instead of opportunities that are provided by military service, you are targeting my son or daughter, right? It's the vocabulary that is used that is not necessarily productive when we're talking about being able to recruit from across this country and have a diverse force. So I think that the education piece needs to be targeted, and we need to make an effort to try to do that.
Thanks. Randee, I wanted to go to you to get your perspective as a public affairs official in the service and a military officer. How have you seen this veteran involvement in the January 6th issue, and then related to what Debra's talking about with that civ-mil gap and the education piece?
I think from a public affairs perspective, both at the Office of Secretary of Defense Public Affairs and then with the services, they have to frame the conversation. It could be overrepresented from a population perspective, but of about 400 people that have had charges preferred, there have been 33 that were active duty or veterans. Only one was active duty. So showing that in the percentage of the millions of people that serve in the military, understanding that first and foremost. Second, understanding that some of the domestic extremist groups that were part of the January 6th riots, insurrection, however people want to frame it, they are recruiting from the same groups that the United States military is recruiting from. Matt discussed the South. Miss Debra discussed the fact that when we talk about gender and ethnic basis on how we recruit as well, there's a predominance of white males. There's also a predominance of white males from the South that are part of these groups. So there should be there is a correlation, and people should be aware of that. And that's something that the military is trying to make itself aware of. I think you guys are aware that Secretary Austin mandated the Extremism Stand Down Day across all branches of the service. Not to say that it is a problem, but to educate people so they can point out certain issues and start having those difficult conversations and making it something in an open forum so everyone can voice their concerns. That's what I would reference with the January 6th. And the military has to have the tough conversations and say, this is not representative of who we are. And I could also maybe point out to when we saw certain actions like this or equal opportunity violations, these people were put out of the military. We do not maintain them in the military. When it comes to recruiting, it's setting the objectives and connecting, making awareness of the opportunities, creating programs that can connect with local communities across the country. Unfortunately, we recruit where we get recruits. It costs a lot more money to go into urban environments or places in the Northeast. And even when they, I can only speak for the Army, when the Army goes into certain, what we would call target markets, they don't get their recruits. So when we only are given a certain budget to actually recruit service members, we're going to go to where we can actually recruit them. And Matt talked at the beginning, I'm in the service. My younger sister was in the service. We both had gone to West Point. My dad was in the military. My grandfathers were both in World War II, and my other great-grandfather in World War I. It becomes a legacy when you don't have the conversations and you can't connect with people. You don't see it as an opportunity for something you want to do with your life.
Thanks, Randee. And also as a legacy soldier, my father and grandparents also served. And Matt, I want to go back to you with that. You touched on this legacy piece, you touched on this recruiting piece, and wanted to get your take from your work in the Air Force, how you thought we might be able to restore this norm, going back to the norms you talked about earlier when we were starting out as an all-volunteer force and the representation across the entire United States.
Well, you know, to get back to one of Randee's points about being able to recruit a more diverse workforce or military. I went back to a pilot training base as the undersecretary to be the keynote speaker for a graduation. And it was the same pilot training base that I graduated from 36 years prior. And it was really interesting that I didn't even notice it until afterwards when my PA officer put together some photos to tweet out and you know, to show this, is that I was standing in the middle of 17 white males and one female. And, you know, it really struck me when I saw that photo, but I didn't really note it at the time as I was visiting with them and meeting their families and that sort of thing. And when I go back to, you know, my graduation from pilot training, it really didn't look much different back in 1983 as it did from 2018. So one of the things that we we're working on in the Air Force is how do we reach out to those other folks, to the females, to African Americans, so that, you know, so that we can all get a richer, more diverse workforce and make us all better in the long run. You know, you mentioned family, Randee. I mean, I have a first lieutenant daughter who just had her first child, and she's an aircrew member, and she flies on a big wing ISR aircraft. But she has to juggle a lot of issues, you know, between taking care of a newborn child. Her husband's also in the military and he just deployed, and she's dealing with the childcare issues, all those kind of things. So one of the things that I did as Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness was to put together a strategy that was long reaching on how are we going to accommodate these people. I think somebody mentioned earlier as well too, is that the people that we're recruiting have certain expectations for careers. You know, how are we going to satisfy that? Our system of personnel management in the Department of Defense really hasn't changed much since the 1950s. And we've tweaked around the margins a little bit with it. But how do we manage the expectations of our people so that we can keep them, maybe without having to give them $500,000 to stay in? and you know, and breaking the bank in that way. So there's a lot of issues that make it very challenging. But it's be able to reach out to those areas other than what we call the Southern Smile, where we get most of our recruits from, because you know, I'm not even sure of the reasons. I'm sure somebody has done studies on it. And how do we reach into being able to sell the military as a career to the people that might be interested in doing it, while at the same time reaching a more diverse workforce that reflects our society, which, oh, by the way, it does pretty much now. You know, at the lower ranks, it's when you get to the senior ranks where it starts to not reflect it as well.
Travis, just echo Matt's points. When I was the marketing director for West Point from 2010 to 2013. When I went to West Point and graduated in 2002, the females, it was 9% of the graduating class. By 2012, 2013, it was about 12%. In 2013, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Raymond Odierno at the time, said, I want to see West Point women's percentage up around 25%. I want to get it to that level. So it took actually echoing a strategy, not changing the standards of admission for West Point, but reaching out to women and not saying what West Point thought these female cadets needed to hear to be interested in West Point. It was reaching out to the type of women we thought would perform well at West Point and doing focused research, asking them what were the misperceptions about serving in the Army, about being an officer, about attending West Point, and then creating a outreach program that was women hosting events like this. It was using technology to target them, find out where they were from buying names from the College Board and the ACT to discuss it, and then having apps and using technology to have these direct conversations. So there wasn't, as much as we like to say, it wasn't behind the great gray walls. And I think the Army has made efforts over the last 7 years to use its website and different apps to try to do the same thing. Is people aren't looking at a brochure. They want to know more than they're going to find on, hey, we're going to give you a $20,000 bonus and you're going to get this type of training. They want to know something like, if I have a baby, what type of maternity leave would I have? They want to know what type of childcare options. And I'm speaking from a women's perspective. And then, you know, Matt referenced a lower percentage maybe in African-American families. That's talking to the mothers. Like, it's doing the research to understand, if you want to recruit an African-American son or daughter, go to the mother, figure out what the mother's questions are. And I don't know if we've done a good enough job to understand those obstacles to create precise strategies that can actually communicate that and articulate it. And to Matt's last point from earlier is, money doesn't actually change anyone's decision in retention. It's actually the quality of life that usually gets people into the military and has them stay if they're challenged and fulfilled, and it's articulating that.
Great, thanks. I just want to remind everyone watching the conference right now to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. But Debra, I wanted to send it over to you really quick and sort of bounce off of what Matt and Randee have been talking about, and from your work on the National Commission, like, how can education play this role? How can we educate our youth in this civic understanding, and what role is that going to play in recruiting and retention? And I think we probably talk in the long term too.
I think it's a vital actually piece of how we engage with the American public, because outside of what I would call the Washington bubble or the national security bubble, you know, even in communities where we have strong military presence and strong military support, we found that the younger generation just didn't know. So for example, when I went down to Jacksonville, Florida with the commission, which is a big Navy town, met with middle school students, they really couldn't, they knew that the Navy was there and sort of, you know, they had ships and things, but, you know, they had never been on the base since 9/11 when we shut them down. And so bases across this country after 9/11 got shut down for security reasons, and the initiation between the military and the community dropped. And then, we've been at war now for 19 years. And so, and whether it's not just deployments, but just operations and basic exercises, we have lost that sort of touch with communities across this country, and even in communities where we have strong military presence. So we need to re-engage. And the commission came out with a number of recommendations in ways to do that, whether it's through the National Guard, who are part of our communities as we see them now, participating in COVID-19 along with the active duty, whether it's a sort of going back and reinvigorating both congressional members and also state and local leaders about the importance of education and getting military knowledge into schools so that they know that it's an option available to them. We're not saying that we should force kids to serve in any way, but what we want is that an average kid, particularly in middle school, when they're trying to figure out what they want to do in life, to be able to have the plethora of options available to them and understand that, hey, you know what, if you want to go to college, you can go to college, and here's several ways you can pay for it, not just federal financial aid, but if you joined the military, you might be able to enlist and get your GI Bill, or you might actually go to college and apply for a ROTC scholarship. It was not surprising to many of us that when we offered those options to young adults across this country, the majority of which responded that they weren't aware of it. So awareness is a big barrier to service, and sort of getting younger Americans to understand that military service is an option, and then what that really means. Going to Randee's point, what does it really mean to serve in the military, right? Is it, do I just carry a gun? Like, do I just have to shoot people? No, you can actually be a doctor in the military. You can actually be a lawyer in the, in the military. And so having those conversations with younger kids today is important so they know their options, and that's what we're saying.
Matt, I wanted to go back to you with that. Is that something you think is a civic education? I mean, it's not the only answer. Do you see it as the unanswer? Is it part of a bigger answer on how we, bounce into this, closing this gap and fixing the norms?
Well, I think education is always key to making sure that people understand what they're talking about. The headlines are filled with hyperbole, and to be able to slice through that and get to the facts is sometimes a really difficult thing to do. For example, I saw a headline about one of the participants in the January 6th event was a retired senior Air Force officer, and but you have to read about 3/4 of the way through the article to find that it's they were talking about a retired lieutenant colonel, and but the headline senior, you expect to see some 2- or 3-star general or something in there. So I think, Randee talked about the Army outreach, the Air Force outreach, trying to talk to the young people these days in their own language, right? Whether it might be using a video game to teach them how, what the Army is all about, what the military is all about. And to Deb's point, it's absolutely crucial to understand that it's not everybody out there, carrying a rifle, slogging through the mud, that there are professions and skills that you can learn that will improve your lot in life for people who may not have that opportunity. So I think education's a big part of it, but we need to make sure that that we have the help of the people they listen to, right? Which is internet, television, movies, Hollywood, big part of it is as well too, and I see a lot of improvement in some of those venues in telling the facts as they are, but they get mucked up pretty quickly, especially when you have highly partisan events that occur.
Thanks. So we've had a lot of really great questions roll in, and I want to get started on those. And so Marine veteran Thomas Brennan and Randee, this one, I'd like to start with you on this one, asks, what tangible steps would each of you like to see newsrooms take to improve civ-mil affairs and understanding of veterans and military families? And then what could those stories look like?
Not the easiest question. One point as we start this, I just want to also reframe this when we talk about the military. There's a lot of DoD civilians as well, and they are an essential part of our military. So these are opportunities, and they deploy as well. When it comes to newsrooms, there's not that many local news institutions that are still around. So you can't find your local newspaper. Margaret Sullivan, one of the professors at Duke this year, has written a book about the death of these newsrooms. That's where you kind of connected the stories of someone's going to join the military. They just finished basic training. They went to a service academy. They're deployed overseas. They just graduated from some school. Those stories aren't there. So what you're left with is, what are the stories in a war zone? And what are the stories left in DC? War zone, it may be a heroic death or a big raid, but that's not going to give the humanity of it. When it comes to DC, it's going to come to what sells newspapers and what is the political rife. You're not going to hear the human interest stories. So it's connecting with military stories about, I'm trying to think. It's hard because there's not those conduits. There really aren't anymore. And I'm sorry, I don't know the Marine veteran's first name, but if there's not a local way to connect, maybe it's on social media, but how are people going to ascribe and like find those stories? It's hard. It's maybe connecting with the local ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC channels and doing something like David Mayer's, I think it's America Strong, like telling those type of stories, but telling the type of stories of they just went to college and they got a new job and the spouse was using a 9/11 GI Bill that was transferred, or the kid is following one of their parents' footsteps, like connecting those type of stories and not making it about war-torn areas or the politics of DC. And I think that's the one thing that we didn't get on. When it comes to the past three administrations, what do they all have in common? We had 2 ongoing wars. So that's the face of the military to Americans. It's not the fact, like my esteemed graduate school, I went to Wharton for business school 10 or 11 years ago. And I actually had people that I thought were very intelligent ask me, do you just walk around and carry a weapon? And what do you do when you're actually in the United States? Showing that side, like what do our everyday lives look like?
Debra, I see your head nodding in acknowledgement, and I have to assume that this came up in the national commission that you were working on. I was wondering if maybe you could weigh in.
You know, it did, and it's as Randee said, it's a hard nut to crack because there's not an easy conduit to get to the people that you want to get to, right? One of the ways that we recommended was to get to younger Americans through junior ROTC or some of the MilCiv programs, the citizenship programs that we currently have, by expanding them into communities that don't have military presence, so that they at a younger age, they start to understand sort of what are the 4 now 5 branches of service? You know, what do each of the branches of service do? What would I do if I was in the military? And just have sort of that basic understanding that they could then share with not just their classmates, but with their parents, with their siblings. That sort of thing. We have to get it out into communities that don't have any sort of exposure, because right now all they get is what they see, whether it's through social media, whether it's through national or local news, and it's all sort of tailored to things that would generate some kind of reaction, and not necessarily a good reaction for most of the time. And so getting sort of that basic understanding out to younger Americans, I think on the education piece would be helpful.
Matt, this one's coming to you. Jennifer Conrad, a SICE alum, has asked, you mentioned the military gets less diverse at the higher ranks. Do you think that there are specific shortcomings in developing and retaining women and minorities. And then many private sector industries, i.e. media, are reckoning with the fact that a lot of women and minorities leave because they don't believe that they can advance.
That was a pretty serious study that was ongoing when the administrations changed over, and I hope the new administration will continue that study because it's very important. When I was working for Secretary Esper and we had the events of last summer, he initiated 3 efforts, if you will, on trying to look into the diversity and equal opportunity issues with that. So he had an immediate review, and then he had an internal board that was led by then Secretary of the Air Force, Barbara Barrett. And then we stood up an actual federal advisory board on diversity and inclusion that when we left, we had just were receiving the nominations for the board membership with that. So I'm sure the new administration is looking into that as well too. But you know, what we were finding through just really a data call and data management through the Office of People Analytics that fell under me was that you were bringing in at the lower ranks actually a much higher representation of diversity than even reflecting across the America. For example, African Americans were at about 19% of the DoD population, where in America they're about 13%, and that kind of went through. You know, the problem was, and same with females. We were not at 50%, you know, or 51% of the population, but it had increased over the years, not as much as maybe we'd like to see, but we were trying to find out what are the roadblocks to keep people in. I mentioned my daughter, you know, she's seriously thinking about getting out of the Air Force because now she's a mom and she has all those pressures and that thing. And, you know, I'm trying to talk her into not doing that because she had a 4-year ROTC education and 2 years of highly specified training, and she really enjoys her job. But those are the things that we need to look at is, how do we remove those roadblocks from our personnel management systems? That's the real key here. How do we accommodate the needs of people as they go through various phases of their life? You know, females get out at like twice the rate as males, but it's usually due because they're the primary caregiver, and you know, maybe it's they can't find childcare, or you know, they're making that decision. On the other hand, we're losing some very senior officers at the colonel level before they get into the general officer level, because at that phase of their life, they may have parents that are aging, that need care. And so they're making a decision based on that, you know. So one of the things that I had proposed was a permeability of service, where you'd be able to move in and out of the various components, if you would, go from the active duty into the Guard and then back again, move into the reserves and then back again. Now we have lots of folks that move that direction, but then when it comes time to come back, it takes like a literal act of Congress for them to get back in. And so they end up just you know, separating for good. So it's those kind of things that I think working with the Congress and the new administration and whoever becomes the new Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness, you know, this spans administrations. This has been going on for years and years. And, you know, we need a really good review and reform of the way we manage our personnel so that we can get after that. So a lot of those things with, you know, and one of the things they mentioned is that at the very senior leadership military levels, they tend to be the combat arms people, you know, because they're the ones who tend to get promoted. You know, is that a paradigm that we need to crack open here a little bit as well too? So if certain minority groups don't go into combat arms, then their promotion opportunities are much less as they get up into the very senior ranks as well too. So It was interesting, you know, we were standing up the Space Force as I left the Department of the Air Force. And the Space Force has an opportunity to build a 21st century service that doesn't necessarily look like all the other ones, right? Because of the requirements that they have, which they're a highly technical service, you know, you know, so how can they use their sort of blank slate, if you will, to build a service that perhaps the other services could now go, wow, they're actually really quick and they're retaining their people, and maybe we could learn some lessons from that as well too.
Randee, I want to kick it over to you for a real quick comment on this one, and then a follow-up question from me.
Yeah, I mean, Matt hit on most of the points. So there's 17% of the military is female. That's a 1% increase since 2004. So in 16 years, we've only had 1%. And I've looked at the statistics. I can speak for the Army. White majority women are the worst performing cohort in the Army. Why is that? It comes to 2 or 3 points that Mac talked about, but it comes to family. As I can hear my 7-month-old in the background screaming and my husband trying to keep him quiet. What are the issues? We're dual military. It's the services trying to find jobs as you get higher in the ranks, trying to keep 2 people's careers going. When you live, eat, and breathe the military, or you've been deployed 6 times, you're usually going to date and likely marry or stay with someone that's in the military. So you have the dual military issue. Then when you have children, you're making a decision. And as much as our society may have advanced, most women will ascribe to the fact that they still feel the responsibility of childcare is on them. So when it's a year-long or a 6-month deployment, they're going to make the decision that no one else can raise my child, someone else can go deploy. But I will say the military in general has made changes. It was a 6-week maternity leave. It's now 3 months. So you have women staying in a little bit more than that. I would say foremost in the Army right now, you have Sergeant Major Grinston, the highest ranking enlisted member in the Army, reaching out to a Facebook group. When you guys said, well, how do you connect? Army Moms, a Facebook group, and seeing that it's issues with making weight after, how they're going to breastfeed and that type of stuff. So the Army, the Air Force, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard, they are recognizing if they want to keep women in, it's a lot of the nexus of childcare. And how do they make some of this easier? How do they learn from big business? Like an issue that came up on a panel that Duke hosted with Women in National Security is childcare. It's actually hard to get it. Even when the military provides it, it's from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. Try to find a military duty day that fits with that and to raise your children. So those are just a few things. If they actually want to retain women, they're going to have to look at that. And while, to Matt's point, while African-American males are, African-American population is 19 versus 13% relative in population, is when they have these opportunities, every company is trying to hire these people and give them different benefits and opportunities so they can stay in the military for what's unfortunately maybe a lower pay, especially cyber, tech, different types of things, or they can go after these other opportunities and they find that's more beneficial for their families.
Thanks. I want to pivot a little bit, and this one is aimed at Debra and Randee, but obviously Matt, open for your comments as well. So the National Defense Strategy recommended that the DoD be more transparent about the challenges it's facing. And so I'd like to talk from a civ-mil perspective. How can we make the DoD more transparent? And what does it mean to be more transparent about these challenges? And then how does the DoD go about communicating its internal challenges? We've seen the sexual assault, sexual harassment pop up time and time again. And so that's obviously something that is very, very important. And the DoD is working on how to communicate. But from your guys' perspective, I just wanted to get your take on how you think that could happen.
Travis, just to make sure I understood, it, specifically on sexual assault, or just how do you be transparent in general?
So transparent in general, and then I just use that as an example of something that requires transparency.
Got it. And Randy's probably better at communications than I am, but I'll take a crack at it. I think, it's hard for us because from DoD's perspective, is because while you want to be transparent, there's this I guess a film of security, right? The more data we share, the less secure we may be. It dawned on me, one of the ways we used to communicate was through TikTok, because that's where the average kid today spends most of their time, right? On TikTok or on social media platforms. But we don't do that anymore because from a military perspective, because of the security reasons. And so there has to be sort of a decision, I think, where we make a determination as, is the value of the security of what we're sharing, whether it's soldiers sharing their lives on TikTok, showing what life really is about in uniform, what they do. Is that protecting that and to keeping it off a social media platform where we believe might be problematic from a security standpoint? Where is that return on investment, right? And part of that is being transparent about it and trying to explain to you, because you still find soldiers and sailors, service members on TikTok doing, not necessarily in uniform, but you still find them there. Because I don't think from a perspective of, from an institutional perspective, it's been a clear understanding of why, right? And what may be acceptable. And I think if we want to be able to communicate with young Americans today, we got to do it in a way that they understand and they absorb information. Because if DoD is trying to be transparent about things and policies and programs that make it more informative for young Americans to understand what it is life is like in the military, then we have to be transparent about it. But we have to do it in a way that also protects our security. So finding that, I think that balance is sort of the needle that we have to thread. And it's a challenge.
Just to hit on Deborah's point is, from a public affairs perspective, bad news does not get better with any time. So it's being willing to figure out how much you know and to be timely in articulating it. This is as much as we know now. We're not hiding anything. We are addressing these issues and we are looking for ways to improve. You referenced the SHARP. So a great case study is the Vanessa Guillen at Fort Hood. There were issues that looked like the Army and DoD was hiding information or did not want to say that it was a military member that was killed, why there were delays in the investigation. It's being willing to take risks with communications. I can say Secretary McCarthy said, no, we're going to get out in front. If you look at, I think the report that was made public is, one thing was the Fort Hood Public Affairs Office was slow and not willing to do a press conference. They weren't willing to articulate these things. It had to all come from DC rather than the leadership at Fort Hood. It's owning your problem and taking leadership and being willing to communicate what you're doing about these problems then. And then people are willing to trust you. To Deborah's other point is, when we're only coming to the public when we want to recruit your sons and daughters or we have a crisis, then we have issues. It's how are we having those conversations at other points? How are we getting out to communities? I can give an example. Special Operations Community does realistic military training across the country, and we'll have black helicopters flying around, but we don't want to talk about it. We don't want you to even know that we're there or we're doing anything. It's going to become obvious. United States Army Special Operations Command looked at it with General Baudet like 2 years ago, saying, if we're going to be there already and the news is going to cover us, once the training is done, why don't we leave some of these helicopters there and talk about the training, how that better prepares us while we're overseas, and interest some of these local communities in what their military is doing for them. So there's these opportunities, but it takes time and it takes effort. And the last point is, leaders have to allow their subordinates to buy down risk so that they can actually communicate with society. No one wants to talk, because if you say one thing bad, it could, people have this worry that it could ruin their careers. In reality, if a word is going to be the worst thing, then we're never going to improve.
If I could jump in on this, Travis, the Office of Force Resiliency falls under Personnel and Readiness, and they get all these not so fun topics: sexual assault, suicides, that sort of thing. And having been a guy who was on the Senate Armed Services Committee making these requests for information, and then being in the Department of Defense answering those requests for information, I can tell you a saying that comes to mind is, never attribute anything to nefarious intent that can't be explained away with bureaucratic incompetence. The Department of Defense is a huge organization. It's huge. And, sometimes things just take time. And Randee certainly knows that, the last thing that the media wants to give you is any time at all to understand issues, especially breaking issues. And the members of Congress and their offices and staffs are the same way. They want answers and they want it right now. And so it's that balance of being able to give them, initial tentative information. And remember, that's usually always wrong. Or it's not, as right as it needs to be, and it changes. So that's a lot of the hesitancy. But I think the DoD does a pretty decent job of getting out in front of these issues and trying to satisfy that thirst for information, but still remaining vigilant so that you don't pass out wrong information that can have worse consequences as well.
Randee, going back to your comments about your work at West Point, one of the viewers asked, the recruitment of additional women at West Point appears to have been successful. Have we looked at replicating that same model with African Americans, minorities, women across the force? And then if so, why have we not seen that success? And if not, if we haven't instituted it, why not?
Everything I say is ascribed just to me, not to the Army or the DoD, because it goes back to Matt's earlier point. We don't use a strategy. At West Point, there is diversity outreach. So they were able to increase the African-American percentage, both women and men. And then they also had good mentorship programs for both women and minorities at West Point so that they could have someone to reach out to, someone, an officer that could serve as an example for them and have conversations. What I saw after West Point, I worked at, was now a defunct organization, but Army marketing, is there was no outreach to women specifically. When it came down to it, there wasn't supposedly a mandate from the Army. This is from a leader that we had at that point in time. So there were no programs to reach out to women. From an African-American perspective, it was good enough to reach out to historically Black colleges and universities. But again, there was not the research. We were not doing the in-depth research to understand the conversations we had to have, where these people were, how many touch points. It's a simple marketing process strategy that could be applied. And sometimes the military doesn't do it well, and they don't incorporate technology. If we can sell Coke around the world, we should be able to have a better conversation about what military service can do for people, but we don't take the time to do the work for the actual strategy for outreach.
So I want to build on that really quick to you, Randee, still. Do you see the shift in the marketing that they've had with the sports teams that are Army-based, the CrossFit style one, the Game Air one? Is that a net win for the DoD or the Army? Is that going to potentially get after what you're talking about?
It's a small market, and I would say most of those people were already joining. So I don't think so. So they had CrossFit and advertising with that, but most of these people, it might work for reserves based on people that are looking there. And I'm trying to think of the Spartan races and the other race that was used. it wasn't something that was getting interested individuals to join the military, because it was like, do you want to do this little game at the end of it, or do you want a t-shirt? That's not enough of a touch point to have the conversation.
Debra, I think that what Randee just talked about goes into what you were talking about from your work on the commission. I was wondering if maybe you wanted to speak on that.
You know, I think part of the challenge too is the Department of Defense is unique in the fact that we have both civilian and military leadership. And so while I would say data is always a challenge to make informed decisions, getting the right data at the right time, input from senior leaders, whether civilian or uniform, also have an impact. And sometimes decisions are based more on culture than they are data, which has an impact long-term. And when you, I guess when you make decisions that are not based on data, you have a different message that gets sent to the public in terms of recruiting, right? So when I make a recruiting ad, but it's targeted for young adults based on our assessment that was done at the time, that these are the issues in which they are interested, but senior leaders roll in and say, well, we don't tell them what the real Army is about. We should have, you know, guns on the battlefield and tanks. And then it doesn't resonate. It has impacts long-term in recruiting for any service. And so, you know, part of this is also understanding how culture of the services and the department play in some of these bigger strategic decisions, and then how do we break those down to be able to actually make the decisions we need to make based on sort of the data and what we're trying, what the objectives we're trying to achieve. Anyway, I'm not quite sure I answered your question, Travis, but I was a point of I just wanted to raise, because I think that is often lost for people who are sort of outside of the beltway in terms of understanding culture in the building.
Travis, just to hit on Deborah's point, I'll say it less politically savvy, is when you have older white gentlemen getting the data and saying, that would not interest me, I don't want to go in that direction, let's do this. They don't realize who we're trying to communicate with is a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old that may be Hispanic, African-American, or a woman. And I think that's where the disconnect continue to happen in outreach efforts.
So we've had a lot of great questions and great conversations, and we're getting a little short on time, but I wanted to close out this 60-second exercise that I like to do at the end. So, and I'm a Star Wars nerd, so I loop this in too. So Star Wars talks about returning balance to the Force. So in 60 seconds, and we'll start with Matt, go to Randee, Debra, how do you think the country can return balance to the civ-mil relations?
Well, I think America needs to demand that its military remain apolitical, and you know, because it spans administrations, it spans political parties, and the Congress, as the representative of the people, needs to ensure that happens, and the media has a role to play as well too, to you know, call out when they see infractions that go against that. And it's very important. And I'll tell you, having just come from there, it was always on the minds of the very senior leaders of the Department of Defense, both the civilian and the military. I'm reminded of General Dunford when he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was masterful about whether it was in a congressional hearing or in a smaller meeting or something, if he was asked a question on policy, he would defer to civilian leadership every time, every single time. He'd say, no, that's for the civilian leaders to decide. I execute policy. I am the senior military advisor and advises them how to execute their policy direction, but I don't make policy. So I just think it would take, you know, the oversight and guidance arms of America, which is the Congress and the media, to enforce that.
Randee, so your 60 seconds on how you think the country can return balance to civ-mil relations.
I don't think it's as bad as people think it is. I think some of the events of the last 6 months had the military do a self-reflection, and it made it more imperative for us to be apolitical, for senior leaders in uniform to say, we do not take an oath to a person. We take an oath to the Constitution, and we have certain roles in American society, and we will work with the 3 branches of government to make sure we stay in line with those requirements.
Debra, your 60 seconds to close us out.
Sure. I mean, I share the sentiments both of Matt and Randee, and I guess I quickly would close out the fact that I think, you know, we're all in this together. And so having a conversation and educating that we all are on the same page when we start the conversation is important, right? So getting back to my civics education and making sure we understand sort of why we have a government, what the government is, and what our military does, and sort of having that conversation in communities so that we start at the same level is important. And I think we need to start doing that now, because obviously we have seen sort of this mil-civ ebb and flow, and as we get shorter in the terms of attention span, as my science teacher used to say, we have the attention span of a gnat. Having those kind of conversations takes time, effort, and commitment and dedication. And so we need to put the effort against it now. And I would actually turn to the students on this program, because you folks are the next generation that will have to take this sort of challenge up. And maybe it's an opportunity for all of you to kind of consider, how do we best do that? So thank you for the opportunity to participate tonight.
Great, thanks. So the gauntlet's been laid for the students watching. The civ-mil relations, Debra said, is you are the next up and comers. So I'd like to thank all our speakers and attendees for joining us tonight. This has been a phenomenal discussion. I think we could continue, the rest of the panel if we had the opportunity.